a florist's box on a marble doorstep. Inside, not roses, but a bullet meant to silence a wife forever. From sunlit mansions to shadowy backrooms, this is the true story of love twisted into a contract for death, and the 19-year chase to catch the man who ordered it. It was the summer of 2002, and in a quiet corner of coastal Thailand, a man believed by many to be a ghost from America's most persistent murder case sat in comfort, convinced the world had forgotten him. James Vincent Sullivan, millionaire, social climber, and for years a fugitive, was living a life that bore no resemblance to the headlines and FBI bulletins that had once carried his name. To most locals, he was just another foreigner with deep pockets, a taste for luxury, and an attractive companion by his side. The white sands outside his condominium glowed under the tropical sun, and the warm air carried the scent of salt and grilled seafood from nearby stalls. The man in the balcony chair might have looked like a retiree enjoying his golden years, but to the authorities half a world away, he was the missing piece in a decades-old puzzle: the execution-style killing of his wife, Lita McClinton Sullivan. Sullivan had been on the run for years. Since the late 1980s, whispers and accusations had followed him. That he'd orchestrated his wife's murder to avoid a costly divorce, that his fortune had bought him freedom, and that he was always one step ahead of law enforcement. Every time investigators thought they had him cornered, he slipped away, first to South America, then Europe, and eventually into the anonymity of Southeast Asia. The story that led him here began far from these beaches, in the deeply divided social landscapes of Boston, Georgia, and Palm Beach. It is a story that winds through ambition and resentment, through marriages that began with charm and ended in betrayal, and through a murder that stunned even seasoned detectives. To understand why Sullivan was in Thailand, and why the FBI wanted him back in the United States, you have to go back decades to the childhood streets of Dorchester, Massachusetts. James Sullivan was born in April 1941, the eldest of 3 children in a working-class Irish Catholic family. His father worked long hours in the printing trade. His mother, devout and determined, kept a tight household. From early on, Sullivan learned 2 things: appearances mattered, and charm could open doors that hard work alone might not. At Boston Latin School, a prestigious and competitive public school, he blended intelligence with a gift for self-promotion. Friends remembered him as a striver, quick with a smile, but always angling for an advantage. He had a knack for making himself sound more important than he was, a habit that would follow him for life. In college, he met Catherine Murray, a bright nursing student from a family with its own share of troubles. Catherine was drawn in by Sullivan's attention and confidence. He, in turn, found in her someone steady and loyal. They married in the mid-1960s, and in just a few years they had 4 children. On paper, it was a picture of domestic stability. In reality, Sullivan's ambition was already pushing beyond the limits of a modest Boston life. The turning point came in 1974, when a wealthy uncle in Georgia offered Sullivan a position running his liquor distribution business. The job promised money and status, and Sullivan negotiated hard, securing not just a role, but an ownership stake and the promise of eventual control. It was a move that uprooted the family from Massachusetts to Macon, Georgia, a cultural leap that Catherine resisted but could not prevent. In Georgia, Sullivan's life changed quickly. The uncle who had given him his big break died suddenly within a year of his arrival, leaving Sullivan in control of the company. The circumstances of that death would later draw hushed speculation. No autopsy, swift cremation, and an heir who showed little outward grief, but no charges were ever brought. What mattered to Sullivan was that he was now wealthy, influential, and in charge. Wealth, however, did not make him faithful or content. His marriage to Catherine collapsed soon after, ending with a settlement that gave her little and left him free to pursue the kind of life he'd always imagined for himself. A life in which money bought access, possessions, and, crucially, people's silence. It was in this new chapter that Sullivan met Lita McClinton, a striking young woman from Atlanta's elite African-American community. Lita was educated, ambitious, and socially connected, the daughter of politically active parents. To her, Sullivan was worldly, confident, and generous, or at least he appeared to be. Their romance developed quickly, despite her parents' unease. The age gap, the cultural divide, and the sense that Sullivan was hiding parts of his past all fueled their misgivings. But in 1976, against that backdrop of doubt, the two were married. What followed was a marriage marked by stark contrasts. Luxury homes and fine clothes on one hand, deep mistrust and constant infidelity on the other. Sullivan could be charming in public, but in private he was controlling, frugal to the point of cruelty, and, as Lita discovered, habitually unfaithful. She threatened to leave more than once, but he would win her back with gifts, expensive jewelry, furs, promises that things would change. They never did. By the early 1980s, the couple's life had expanded to include a lavish Palm Beach mansion, but their relationship was fraying beyond repair. Lita began to prepare for divorce, determined to secure a fair settlement. What she could not have known was that her decision would set in motion events that would end with a man at her doorstep, holding a box of roses and a gun. And years later, it would end with that same husband, halfway around the world, staring at the Gulf of Thailand from a balcony. Still rich, still free, and still certain that he'd beaten the system. Palm Beach in the early 1980s was a world apart, even from the rest of Florida. The barrier island glittered with the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Private clubs, manicured hedges hiding Mediterranean-style estates, and a social hierarchy that could be as exclusionary as it was polite. Into this rarefied air stepped James Sullivan, armed with money, confidence, and a determination to be noticed. For Sullivan, the Palm Beach mansion wasn't just a home. It was a stage. The oceanfront property had a pedigree. Arched windows, terraces with sweeping views of the Atlantic, and an address that opened doors to the island's elite. But for all its architectural beauty, the real prize was what it symbolized. In Palm Beach, a grand house was a declaration you belonged, or at least you wanted everyone to believe you did. But there was a complication, and it was one Sullivan had anticipated long before the ink dried on the purchase contract. His wife, Lita, beautiful, poised, and undeniably magnetic, was also black. A fact that, in the coded social world of Palm Beach, would provoke whispered disapproval and outright snubs. Sullivan knew this, and according to later accounts, he deliberately kept her out of view during the negotiation for the house, fearing the sellers might back out if they learned who would actually live there. For Lita, the move to Palm Beach was hardly a dream realized. She hadn't wanted the house, and when she finally saw it, her first impressions were chilly. It wasn't just the building itself. It was the way the decision had been made without her, a pattern that had marked much of her marriage. To Sullivan, her opinion on such matters was irrelevant. The house was his vision, and in his mind, that was the end of it. Their life in Palm Beach quickly became a study in contrasts. There were elegant parties, trips abroad, and afternoons by the pool. But behind the facade, the marriage was eroding. Sullivan's infidelities had never stopped, and Lita, no longer willing to look the other way, began confronting him more openly. The man who once used charm to win her over now relied on control, limiting her spending, keeping a tight grip on access to valuables, and, when pressed, offering extravagant gifts as peace offerings. By the winter of 1982, Lita's patience was worn thin. The breaking point came with a Christmas card, a seemingly small thing, but it carried a sting that cut deep. It was addressed to Sullivan, and inside was a message from another woman: "Missing your kisses at Christmas." The card was signed by someone Lita already suspected, a woman named Tanya Tanksley. That discovery pushed Lita past the point of silent endurance. She didn't confront Sullivan in the privacy of their home. Instead, she went straight to Tanksley's residence and demanded the truth. She got it, a blunt confirmation of the affair. Then she packed her belongings, loaded up her car, and drove to Atlanta, back to the safety of her parents' home. When Sullivan returned to find her gone, and valuable items missing from the house, he was furious. His reaction was swift. Divorce papers, complete with a detailed list of the possessions he wanted returned. What followed was a month of legal and personal brinksmanship, each side holding ground. But beneath the legal posturing, there was a different truth. Neither of them truly wanted to end it. Not yet. Lita's move had been as much a challenge as a departure. She wanted respect, he wanted control, and so, reluctantly, she returned. For a while, there was an uneasy peace. They attended events together, posed for photographs, and kept up appearances. But the trust between them was gone. Lita began to take steps, quietly, deliberately, toward protecting herself. She learned more about Sullivan's finances, and she began to consider what a divorce settlement might look like if she initiated it. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Sullivan's wealth gave him power, and his willingness to use intimidation made him dangerous. By the mid-1980s, friends noticed a change in her. She was still warm and engaging in public, but there was an undercurrent of tension. She spoke more openly about her unhappiness and her fears. Her parents, who had never trusted Sullivan, worried that the marriage was heading towards something worse than divorce. And then came January 16, 1987. That morning, Lita was at her townhouse in Atlanta. The weather was damp, the air cool. She was expecting flowers, a delivery of roses, and when the doorbell rang, she went downstairs. Waiting for her was a man holding a box. Inside, instead of blooms, was the barrel of a gun. The single shot that followed ended her life instantly. The killer vanished. In the hours and days that followed, police pieced together the basics. Lita had been targeted, the attack was planned, and the timing, just before a key divorce court date, was no coincidence. Suspicion fell immediately on Sullivan. The motive was painfully clear. With Lita gone, he would keep his fortune and his properties, free from the financial and legal entanglements of divorce. But suspicion and proof are not the same thing. And James Sullivan, as he had before and would again, managed to stay just beyond the reach of the law. The murder of Lita McClinton Sullivan sent shockwaves through Atlanta's upscale Cascade Heights community. It wasn't just the brutality of the act. A young, vibrant woman cut down in the doorway of her own home. It was the precision. There had been no struggle, no random break-in, no theft. Whoever pulled the trigger had come for one reason only. Police arrived to a scene that told them as much about what had happened as what hadn't. The townhouse showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing was disturbed. No valuables were missing. Lita had been expecting a delivery, which meant the killer either posed as a deliverman or actually was one. Someone paid to bring her a package she would willingly accept. The roses were the bait. The gunshot was the trap snapping shut. Investigators worked quickly, interviewing friends, neighbors, and family. The portrait they painted was one of a woman in the midst of a contentious divorce. Court records confirmed that Lita and James Sullivan were scheduled for a hearing that very day. A hearing expected to finalize financial details that could have cost Sullivan a significant portion of his fortune. Now, with Lita gone, those proceedings were moot. From the first hours, detectives made no secret of their belief. Sullivan had the motive. He also had the means, a $5 million fortune and connections that could buy loyalty or silence. But belief is not enough for an arrest warrant. What they needed was evidence, and that would prove elusive. Sullivan, for his part, was careful. He denied any involvement, projecting shock and sorrow in public while quietly insulating himself from legal exposure. He kept his distance from the investigation, using lawyers as intermediaries, and never letting himself be caught in an unguarded moment with police. He was no stranger to leverage. He knew the burden of proof lay on the state, and he was determined to make that burden heavy. The investigation began to focus on the possibility of a contract killing. Detectives started tracing Sullivan's associates, looking for anyone in his orbit who might have been willing, for a price, to pull the trigger. They found whispers, half-leads, names passed along in low tones. But in the first months, nothing concrete tied Sullivan directly to the man with the gun. Behind the scenes, though, the pressure was mounting. Lita's parents, Emery and Joan McClinton, were relentless. They spoke with investigators regularly, pressing for updates, urging them not to let the trail grow cold. To them, this wasn't just a homicide case. It was a fight for their daughter's dignity and for justice that seemed always just out of reach. The break investigators needed came not in the form of physical evidence, but human weakness. Over time, people connected to the murder-for-hire arrangement began to talk, sometimes to brag, sometimes to save themselves from other charges. Small details surfaced. The payment amount the intermediaries used to distance Sullivan from the shooter, the planning that went into making the murder look like a chance encounter. Each detail was a thread, and investigators began pulling. In the years that followed, Sullivan would be named in civil lawsuits brought by the McClintons, accused outright of arranging the killing. In civil court, the standard of proof is lower, and while the McClintons secured judgments against him, those victories didn't translate into criminal convictions. For Sullivan, the lawsuits were an inconvenience. Expensive, perhaps, but survivable. They were not the prison sentence his former in-laws so desperately wanted. Meanwhile, the social life that had once been his armor began to fray. Whispered accusations followed him into clubs, parties, and business meetings. Old friends kept their distance. Women he courted learned enough of his past to make their own quiet exits. Still, Sullivan maintained the same confidence he had always worn. The confidence of a man who believed he was smarter than the people chasing him. The investigation, however, wasn't dead. Detectives kept files open, kept contacts alive, and kept their ears to the ground. They knew time could be a weapon. Witness loyalties shift, grudges deepen, and people age into desperation. A man who could keep a secret at 30 might find it harder at 40, especially if his own freedom or finances were at stake. That patience paid off in the 1990s, when a key figure in the original conspiracy was arrested on unrelated charges. Facing the prospect of a long prison sentence, he began to talk, and what he said pointed directly back to Sullivan. The account matched pieces of information police had gathered years earlier. The price of the hit, the method of approach, the calculated timing to coincide with the divorce proceedings. By the late 1990s, prosecutors believed they finally had enough to act. In 1998, more than a decade after Lita's death, a warrant was issued for James Sullivan's arrest on charges of arranging her murder. But when they went to serve it, he was gone. When the Fulton County arrest warrant for James Sullivan was signed in 1998, law enforcement knew they were up against more than just another suspect. This was a man who had built his adult life on controlling outcomes, in business, in marriage, and, if the allegations were true, in life and death itself. By the time the warrant became public, Sullivan was already gone. How long he'd been planning his disappearance is a question investigators still debate. Some believed he'd been quietly laying the groundwork for years, moving assets, testing the waters of life overseas, cultivating contacts who could help him vanish. Others thought the flight was more reactive, a sudden calculation that the walls were closing in and it was time to go. Either way, when authorities knocked, there was no door for them to open. The first confirmed sightings put him in South America. In that part of the world, Sullivan's money and air of respectability could still work in his favor. A well-dressed American businessman could slip into expatriate circles without attracting much attention. He kept moving, a few months here, a few months there, rarely staying in one place long enough for the FBI to close the gap. From South America, he drifted into Europe. The trail ran through airports, bank transfers, and faint sightings in cities like Madrid and Vienna. Sometimes agents would arrive just days behind him, finding nothing but the faint residue of his presence. A hotel bill, a name on a flight manifest, a rumor from a bartender who remembered the accent and the expensive watch. Each close call seemed to make him bolder. The FBI would later learn that during this time, Sullivan stayed in touch with acquaintances back in the U.S., almost taunting them with the knowledge that he was untouchable. He avoided the sort of high-profile blunders that trip up many fugitives. No public disputes, no careless spending sprees, but he also didn't live like a man in hiding. To those who encountered him abroad, he was just another American with a good story and the money to live well. By the late 1990s, his path had carried him to Asia, where his luck and perhaps his overconfidence would eventually run out. Thailand was the kind of place where a man with money could build a comfortable anonymity. Sullivan settled into a coastal resort town, taking a luxury condominium in a gated complex. His companion was a striking Thai woman who, like him, was no stranger to reinvention. Neighbors saw them as a wealthy couple enjoying the good life. Seaside walks, fine dining, a BMW in the driveway. From his balcony, Sullivan could see the Gulf of Thailand stretch to the horizon, a daily reminder of how far he'd traveled from the damp Atlanta morning when Lita had been killed. He must have thought the distance was permanent. The FBI had been chasing him for over a decade. His name still appeared on most wanted lists, but so did hundreds of others. In his mind, he'd beaten them. But the very comfort that made him feel safe was what undid him. In May 2002, an episode of America's Most Wanted aired a segment on Lita's unsolved murder, featuring Sullivan's face and story. It reached millions, including one of his neighbors in Thailand. The man recognized him immediately and picked up the phone. Within hours, the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok had the tip, and the wheels of an international arrest were turning. The Thai police put Sullivan under surveillance. At first, the younger officers doubted they had the right man. The fugitive in the FBI's old photographs seemed younger, sharper. But the habits matched. The car, the routines, the meticulous fitness regimen. Bit by bit, they were sure. On the night of July 2, 2002, heavily armed Thai officers closed in. Sullivan and his fiancée had just returned from a walk when a pounding came at the door. Seconds later, the lock burst and uniformed men flooded the room. The words were simple and final. "James Sullivan, you are under arrest." For the first time in 15 years, Sullivan wasn't in control. When the door to Sullivan's condominium in Charam, Thailand, blew open, it wasn't the cinematic chase scene of an action movie. There was no foot trace through crowded streets, no leap over balconies. Instead, the man who had once bragged about outsmarting the FBI sat stunned on the edge of his bed, watching as strangers in uniform rifled through his life. The Thai officers had come prepared. Weapons ready, arrest warrant in hand, and orders from Bangkok to take no chances. Sullivan was calm at first, perhaps thinking this was a mistake that could be smoothed over with money or words. But as they pulled open drawers, boxed up paperwork, and read out the charges, the reality began to settle on him. This wasn't a shakedown. This was the end of his run. His fiancée, Chongwatna Nana Srikaroenmuang, pleaded ignorance, telling the police she had no idea the man she loved was wanted for murder. She broke down in tears as they led him away in handcuffs. The life they had built, the seaside walks, the dinners, the privacy, collapsed in minutes. Half a world away, the news hit Atlanta like a thunderclap. For Lita's parents, Emery and Joan McClinton, the phone call was the one they had been waiting for since the morning their daughter was killed. Sullivan was in custody. The man they had named for years as the orchestrator of her death was behind bars. Joan later said she and her family celebrated that night, pouring champagne and savoring each hour Sullivan spent in a cell. "We are going to enjoy every day he is incarcerated," her daughter Valencia told reporters. For them, it was more than an arrest. It was vindication after years of frustration, courtrooms, and dead ends. In Thailand, Sullivan's new reality was stark. Gone were the tailored shirts and the airy seaside condo. He traded them for stained prison-issue shorts, a thin pullover, and a cell built for 20 men but packed with 50. He was the only foreigner, his pale skin and dress socks marking him as an outsider in every sense. The cell was hot, noisy, and unrelenting. For a man who had spent years curating his comforts, it was a world turned upside down. Thai officials announced he would remain in custody while the United States pursued extradition. That process, they warned, could be lengthy. The Thai legal system had its own procedures, and Sullivan had the right to fight the transfer. For the FBI, the arrest was a major victory, but they knew the case was far from over. A fugitive in custody is not the same thing as a conviction in court. Reporters swarmed the story. To the public, Sullivan was the archetype of the charming villain. The millionaire playboy accused of having his wife murdered to protect his fortune, then living in luxury overseas while justice waited. Every photo of him in custody, every detail about his prison conditions, became part of the narrative. For Sullivan himself, the days ahead would be a different kind of battle. He had escaped once, not from a cell, but from the consequences of suspicion. Now, for the first time, he was trapped in a system where his wealth couldn't simply buy him back to safety. His past had caught up with him, and the long shadow of Lita's murder was finally within striking distance. For James Sullivan, the arrest in Thailand was not the end of the fight. It was the start of a new one. He had no illusions about what awaited him in Georgia. If he was extradited to the United States, prosecutors would put him on trial for capital murder, and the penalty could be death. That reality gave him a clear objective: stay in Thailand, or at the very least, keep the American legal system at bay for as long as possible. Thai prisons were harsh, but to Sullivan, they were preferable to a Georgia death chamber. His lawyers quickly set to work, filing motions, challenging the validity of the extradition request, and exploiting every procedural avenue available. They argued technicalities, questioned witness credibility, and pressed the Thai courts to weigh whether the U.S. justice system could guarantee a fair trial. Back in Atlanta, prosecutors were preparing for the day Sullivan would finally be in their courtroom. They had waited more than 15 years, and time had changed the case. Witnesses had aged, memories had faded, but there was also an advantage. Over those years, people connected to the murder-for-hire plot had talked. Some had struck deals, others had come forward in exchange for leniency in unrelated charges. Piece by piece, the chain between Sullivan and the man who pulled the trigger had become stronger. At the center of the state's case was the timeline. The murder happened on the morning Lita was set to appear in divorce court, where she was expected to secure a substantial settlement. Prosecutors planned to argue that Sullivan's motive was simple: eliminate his wife, and he eliminated both the financial loss and the public embarrassment. They also had the testimony of the hitman's associates, intermediaries who claimed Sullivan had provided the money and the orders. It was a classic murder-for-hire structure. Sullivan at the top, a go-between to keep his hands clean, and a triggerman who could vanish. For years, that insulation had protected him. Now, prosecutors believed it was finally breached. The McClinton family followed each development from home. Every legal filing in Thailand, every hint that Sullivan might be stalling, was both infuriating and exhausting. They had learned patience the hard way, but with Sullivan in custody, patience felt different. The end was in sight if he could be brought back. It took more than 2 years. In 2004, after a protracted legal battle, the Thai government approved the extradition. One of the key concessions was that Georgia prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty, a promise that satisfied Thai law and removed one of Sullivan's last legal footholds. When the decision was announced, the FBI wasted no time. Agents flew to Thailand, escorted Sullivan onto a plane, and began the long journey back to the United States. For a man who had once crossed continents freely, every step was now dictated by others. Shackled, flanked by armed escorts, he was no longer the globe-trotting millionaire. He was an inmate. When the plane touched down in Atlanta, the symbolism was not lost on anyone. After nearly 2 decades, James Vincent Sullivan was back in the city where Lita had lived, loved, and died, and where a jury would decide his fate. When James Sullivan stepped into a Fulton County courtroom for the first time, it was as though time itself had bent back on itself. For the McClinton family, seeing him in person, not in news clips from overseas, not in photographs from the past, but in flesh and blood, was a moment they had imagined for years. The man they believed had ordered Lita's death was finally standing before a judge, facing the justice system he had dodged for so long. Prosecutors arrived with boxes of evidence, a witness list built over decades, and a clear, simple theme: greed and control. In their telling, Sullivan's entire life had been a performance of charm masking calculation. He had married Lita, enjoyed the social and personal advantages she brought, and when the marriage became a liability, financially and socially, he had her removed from the equation. Permanently, the timeline they presented was tight and damning. Lita's murder occurred on the morning she was to appear in divorce court. Her legal team was prepared to push for a settlement that could have cost Sullivan millions. Eliminating her hours before that hearing meant his fortune remained intact. They layered on the human element: the deliverman disguise, the box of roses hiding a gun, the cold precision of a single shot. This wasn't a crime of passion, they argued. It was business executed like a transaction. Key witnesses brought the prosecution's theory into sharper focus. The alleged middleman, who had already served time in connection with the case, testified about conversations linking Sullivan to the plan. Acquaintances of the triggerman corroborated details: the payment arrangements, the description of the target, the instructions to strike on that specific day. It was the connective tissue prosecutors had lacked in the 1980s, now bolstered by years of accumulated testimony. The defense countered with a different picture entirely. They painted Sullivan as a man wrongfully accused, the victim of opportunists and liars seeking reduced sentences or personal gain. They questioned the reliability of witnesses whose memories stretched back nearly 2 decades, highlighting inconsistencies and the absence of physical evidence directly tying Sullivan to the crime scene. They also leaned on Sullivan's public persona, a man who, whatever his marital failings, had no need to kill. If he wanted to end the marriage, they argued, he could have settled financially and moved on. Murder, they suggested, was both unnecessary and out of character. The courtroom atmosphere was electric. Every cross-examination became a contest of wills, with the defense probing for cracks and the prosecution reinforcing their narrative. For Lita's family, the process was grueling, reliving the worst day of their lives, listening to the defense frame it as a misunderstanding or fabrication. But as the weeks passed, the cumulative weight of the prosecution's case began to press down. The financial motive, the timing, the testimony from those inside the murder-for-hire chain. The picture that emerged was one of intent, deliberate, calculated, and ruthless. When the case went to the jury, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. It had taken more than 18 years to get to this point. Now, 12 strangers would decide if the man who had once lived above the law would spend the rest of his life beneath it. The jury filed back into the Fulton County courtroom with the kind of deliberate calm that makes everyone watching hold their breath. For nearly 3 weeks, they had heard testimony about a marriage built on charm and control, about a divorce heading toward a costly climax, and about a gunman who showed up on Lita Sullivan's doorstep with a box of roses. James Sullivan sat still at the defense table, hands folded, his expression unreadable. He had built a life on masking his intentions, whether closing a business deal, seducing a new partner, or, prosecutors argued, arranging his wife's murder. Now, the outcome was out of his hands. When the foreperson read the verdict, guilty of murder, there was a sharp intake of breath across the room. On the prosecution's side, quiet smiles and clasped hands. On the McClinton family's side, a wave of emotion that had been building for 18 years finally broke. Joanne and Emery McClinton held each other, tears in their eyes. Valencia, Lita's sister, sat with a look that was equal parts grief and relief. Justice had taken a lifetime, but it had arrived. For Sullivan, the verdict was a collapse in slow motion. His attorneys had fought to frame the state's case as circumstantial, dependent on aging memories and questionable witnesses. But the jury had connected the dots, the timing of the murder, the financial stakes, the chain of intermediaries linking him to the triggerman. The pattern was too deliberate to ignore. Sentencing followed swiftly. Because Georgia had waived the death penalty to secure extradition from Thailand, the maximum was life in prison. The judge imposed it without hesitation. Sullivan would spend the rest of his days behind bars, no parole eligibility for decades. The man who had once lived in mansions from Macon to Palm Beach, who had sipped champagne on Thai balconies, now faced the monotony of a cell. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the McClintons. Joanne spoke with the measured grace she had maintained through years of hearings, delays, and false starts. "We have waited a long time for this," she said. "Lita deserved to live her life. He took that from her. Today we saw accountability." For Sullivan, there were no public statements, no final attempt to charm the cameras. He was led away in shackles, head down, the sound of clicking shutters following him out. The same public that had once read about his opulent lifestyle now saw him as a convicted murderer. But while the trial was over, the story was not entirely finished. Appeals would follow, legal maneuvers aimed at finding technical errors, questioning the admissibility of evidence, or claiming ineffective counsel. Sullivan was not the kind of man to surrender quietly, even from a prison cell. Yet the central truth remained. After nearly 2 decades of evasion, accusation, and relentless pursuit, the law had caught up with James Vincent Sullivan. The gavel had fallen, the verdict was in, and the sentence was final, at least for the moment. But the case of James Vincent Sullivan did not simply vanish into the archives. Even from prison, Sullivan remained a presence in the courts, in the press, and in the minds of those who had pursued him for nearly 2 decades. For Sullivan, The adjustment from luxury to incarceration was more than a change in surroundings. It was the stripping away of an identity he had curated for decades. Gone were the tailored suits, the imported cigars, the oceanside balconies. In their place, a small cell, state-issued clothing, and a regimented schedule dictated by prison guards rather than personal whim. For a man who had once measured status in square footage and wine vintages, the sameness of prison life was its own kind of punishment. He retained lawyers, of course, men and women tasked with combing through trial transcripts, motions, and evidentiary rulings in search of reversible error. Appeals were filed, each one dissecting some portion of the trial. The testimony of the middleman, the credibility of certain witnesses, the handling of pretrial publicity. But one by one, the appeals were denied. The original conviction held firm, the court's ruling that the jury had been within its rights to believe the state's narrative. For the McClinton family, the years after the verdict brought a different kind of work. Joanne, Valencia, and Emery carried Lita's story into public spaces, speaking to civic groups, engaging in advocacy, and ensuring her name was not lost in the shadow of the man who had taken her life. They described her as she had been before the headlines. Vibrant, ambitious, devoted to family, a woman with plans that stretched far beyond Atlanta. Valencia especially spoke about the complexity of justice. A conviction, she said, doesn't erase the loss or restore the life stolen, but it does close a chapter. It means the person responsible is no longer free to harm others. In that sense, the trial's end allowed for a measure of peace, not because the pain diminished, but because the waiting was finally over. In Georgia's prison system, Sullivan faded from public view. The occasional filing in an appellate court might draw a short news item, but the image of him as the globe-trotting fugitive began to dissolve into something else. An inmate serving life for murder, one of thousands. His cell was no different from the rest. His meals, his privileges, his routines, all dictated by the same rules he once believed he could outmaneuver. He was in his 60s now, his auburn hair long gone to gray, the lean athletic build softened by time. The social circles he had once cultivated were gone. In their place were the hierarchies of prison, a world where wealth meant little and reputation was earned or lost on different terms entirely. For those who had worked the case, detectives, prosecutors, FBI agents, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing he would never again watch the sun rise over an ocean from the comfort of a private terrace. But there was also an awareness that the win had come at a price. 18 years of pursuit, millions in investigative resources, and a family that had spent nearly 2 decades fighting to keep their daughter's case alive. The McClintons often said that justice for Lita was not just about the conviction. It was about the message that persistence matters, that even a wealthy, well-connected fugitive could be brought to account. Her story, they hoped, would serve as a reminder that the law may move slowly, but it moves. In the years after James Sullivan's conviction, the case settled into a place in Georgia's legal history that few others had. It wasn't just another high-profile murder. It was a masterclass in persistence, a rare example of law enforcement keeping pressure on a suspect across decades, continents, and political boundaries until there was no place left to hide. Inside the Fulton County District Attorney's office, prosecutors pointed to the Sullivan case when explaining why cold case units mattered. Without the steady accumulation of testimony, the patient cultivation of witnesses, and the willingness to reopen files year after year, the arrest in Thailand might never have happened. It became a blueprint. Don't let the trail go cold, even if it takes a generation to bring someone in. For the FBI, the case underscored the value and unpredictability of public engagement. It was not a secret agent or a sophisticated surveillance operation that finally pinpointed Sullivan's location. It was a television viewer in Thailand, watching America's Most Wanted, recognizing the face of his neighbor, and making a phone call. The Bureau began doubling down on public outreach for fugitive cases, knowing that the right set of eyes in the right place could succeed where years of formal investigation had stalled. The media, too, drew lessons. The image of Sullivan as the charming, jet-setting millionaire, contrasted with the cold brutality of Lita's killing, was a narrative tailor-made for television. True crime documentaries, magazine features, and talk shows picked over the details, often leaning into the contrast between the life he built and the violence he was accused of ordering. But there were layers to Sullivan's story that remained stubbornly opaque. Questions about his past, particularly the sudden death of his wealthy uncle years before Lita's murder, resurfaced from time to time. No charges had ever been filed, and no official inquiry had tied him to anything improper, but the whispers persisted. To many, the pattern of convenience was too striking to ignore. A benefactor dies and Sullivan inherits. A wife threatens his fortune, and she's gone. Those unresolved shadows became part of the case's cultural afterlife. In true crime circles, Sullivan was often discussed not just as the architect of one murder, but as a figure who seemed to live at the intersection of opportunity, manipulation, and suspicion. For the McClinton family, however, the focus was always on Lita, her life, her achievements, her laughter. They worked to ensure she wasn't remembered only as a victim, but as a person whose promise was cut short. Valencia, in particular, spoke openly about the trap of letting her sister's story be defined solely by the man who killed her. She had her own story before him, she told one interviewer. We keep that story alive. Meanwhile, Sullivan adjusted to the slow erosion of time in prison. The appeals dwindled, the news coverage faded, and the life he had once lived, the tailored shirts, the dinners on Worth Avenue, the polished charm, became a relic of a world he would never re-enter. If he had once believed he could outrun the law forever, the truth had caught him, and it was measured not in years but in the quiet, unchanging routine of incarceration. In the end, the Sullivan case became more than a single trial or a single murder. It became a reminder that justice, when it comes, is rarely quick, but with enough determination, it can still arrive. Long before her name became attached to a murder case, Lita LaVaughn McClinton was a daughter, a sister, and a woman whose life moved easily between the polished spaces of Atlanta's social scene and the close warmth of family gatherings. She was born into a household where achievement was expected, but where love and encouragement were constant. Her parents, Emery and Joanne McClinton, were fixtures in Atlanta's civic and political life. Emery worked in civil rights enforcement for the U.S. Department of Transportation. Joanne was active in the NAACP, the Urban League, and Democratic Party politics. Their home in Cascade Heights was a place of purpose, the kind where dinner conversations could range from schoolwork to current events to the hard realities of inequality and the long fight to change it. Lita was the eldest of three, and from the start, she had a light that drew people in. She was stylish in a way that seemed effortless, the kind of person who could make an ordinary outfit look like it belonged in a magazine. She was quick with a laugh, tuned in to the moods of people around her, and had a knack for making friends in any setting. Her education reflected both discipline and ambition. She attended St. Pius X High School, excelling academically, then went on to Spelman College, where she majored in political science. Friends from those years remember her as someone who could hold her own in a debate and still charm everyone at the table. Fashion was her passion, but she also had the mind for law or politics, and the confidence to believe she could succeed in either world. After graduation, she pursued her love for fashion, working as an assistant buyer at a boutique in Atlanta's Lenox Square Mall. It was there, amid racks of designer coats and carefully arranged displays, that she first met James Sullivan, a customer at the time, looking for a gift. He noticed her immediately. She was poised, articulate, and beautiful. For Lita, the attraction was more cautious. He was older, more worldly, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that could be magnetic or dangerous, depending on the man behind it. The romance unfolded quickly. Sullivan courted her with expensive dinners, trips, and gifts. Lita's parents, protective of their daughter, were skeptical. They saw in Sullivan a man who was eager to impress but reluctant to reveal much about himself. The age difference bothered them, as did his lack of transparency about his past. Still, Lita was in love, and she believed she could build a life with him. Marriage changed the setting but not the dynamic. Lita found herself moving between two worlds, the refined social circles of Palm Beach and the racial and social tensions of Macon, Georgia, where Sullivan's business was based. She became a hostess, decorator, and social partner, all while trying to keep a sense of her own identity. But her marriage was not the safe harbor she had imagined. Friends and family began to hear stories of Sullivan's controlling behavior, his frugality despite his wealth, and, most painfully, his infidelity. Lita, proud and private, tried to manage these struggles quietly at first. She confronted him when she found proof, but each confrontation seemed to end with apologies, gifts, and promises that didn't last. By the mid-1980s, she was thinking seriously about divorce, not just to end the marriage, but to reclaim her independence. Those close to her say she was ready to rebuild her life, to step out from under Sullivan's control and return to the things that made her happiest. The divorce proceedings were her path to freedom. That path ended violently on the morning of January 16, 1987. When news of her death broke, it wasn't just the loss of a young woman with beauty and grace. It was the loss of potential. Lita had a life in front of her, one that could have taken any number of directions. In the days that followed, her friends and family remembered her not in terms of the crime, but as the person they had known. Warm, sharp-witted, compassionate, and determined. To them, she would always be more than the victim in a headline. She was Lita, a sister who laughed easily, a daughter who made her parents proud, and a woman who was ready to write the next chapter of her life on her own terms. January 16, 1987, began like so many other Atlanta mornings. Cool, damp air settling over Cascade Heights, the quiet hum of a neighborhood waking up. At Lita Sullivan's townhouse, the day carried extra weight. She was due in divorce court within hours, a hearing that would decide how much of James Sullivan's fortune she would walk away with. Friends say she had prepared carefully, her legal team confident, her mind focused. Sometime after 9 a.m., the doorbell rang. Through the glass of her front door, Lita saw a man holding a long white box, the kind florists use for roses. It wasn't unusual. Flowers were a common gesture from friends or well-wishers, especially on a day as significant as this. She opened the door. In the space of a breath, the scene turned from routine to lethal. From inside that box, instead of blooms, the man produced a small-caliber pistol. A single shot rang out, striking Lita in the head. She collapsed in her own doorway, the box still in the killer's hands. Without a word, he turned and left, disappearing down the quiet street. The call to 911 brought police racing to the townhouse. The crime scene was as stark as it was shocking. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms, no theft. It was immediately clear this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. It was an execution. Someone had come here with the express purpose of killing Lita, and they had done it with chilling efficiency. Neighbors spoke of hearing a loud pop, then nothing. One or two had seen a man walking quickly away, but the description was vague. Average height, medium build, wearing a cap. No one had seen his face clearly enough to make an identification. When detectives called Lita's parents, Joanne and Emery McClinton, the news hit like a physical blow. Hours earlier, they'd been expecting to meet their daughter in court. Now they were being told she was gone. Joanne later said the moment felt unreal, as though she were standing outside herself, hearing words that didn't make sense. Investigators moved quickly to secure evidence. They photographed the scene, dusted for fingerprints, canvassed the area for witnesses. The florist's box was taken into evidence, a prop turned murder weapon concealment. Forensics would later confirm what they already suspected. This was no random act. The killer had planned every detail, right down to using a disguise designed to lower Lita's guard. Within hours, the investigation began to focus on motive. The divorce hearing was a glaring marker on the calendar, one that, to detectives, connected directly to the shooting. With Lita gone, the financial settlement she was seeking would never happen. The person who benefited most from her death was obvious: James Sullivan. When police reached him for questioning, his response was measured. He expressed shock, said he had nothing to do with the killing, and left the rest to his lawyers. Detectives noted the lack of visible grief, but absence of emotion was not evidence. What they needed was a trail, money, witnesses, anything that could connect him to the man with the gun. The first day ended with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. This was a murder for hire. Someone had paid to have Lita killed. And if that someone was James Sullivan, he had been careful, very careful. to keep his own fingerprints off the plan. In the weeks ahead, investigators would begin to follow the money, track rumors of intermediaries, and piece together a conspiracy that stretched far beyond Atlanta. But in those first hours, the mission was simpler, more personal. Find who had taken Lita from her family and bring them to justice. From the moment the coroner removed Lita's body from her townhouse, Atlanta homicide detectives knew this case would hinge on one thing: breaking through the wall between the man who pulled the trigger and the person who ordered him to be there. In murder-for-hire cases, that wall is deliberate. It's built with intermediaries, with cash that leaves no paper trail, and with just enough distance so that, in court, the one paying the bills can say they never met the killer. In Lita's case, the wall looked solid, but every wall has cracks. Detectives began with the most basic question: who had the means, motive, and connections to arrange a hit like this? The answer, James Sullivan, was almost too obvious. They couldn't arrest him on suspicion alone. They needed someone inside the plot to talk. In the weeks after the murder, whispers began circulating in Atlanta's underworld. A man named Philip Harwood, a former associate of Sullivan's, appeared on detectives' radar. Harwood wasn't the shooter, but he was connected to people who could find one. Police leaned in. They interviewed, they pressured, and they watched as bits of information slipped out. The amount allegedly paid for the job, the timing, the instructions to disguise the weapon in a florist's box. From Harwood, the trail moved to the suspected triggerman, a small-time criminal named Mark Davis. Davis's background was exactly what detectives expected: petty crimes, hustles for cash, and a willingness to do dangerous work for the right price. But Davis wasn't talking. Without his cooperation, the chain linking Sullivan to the killing was incomplete. Meanwhile, Sullivan maintained his calm. In public, he appeared composed, even aloof, as though the murder was a tragedy that touched him only at a distance. In private, according to friends of Lita, he was seething about the divorce proceedings she'd been pursuing. To police, the connection was clear. She was killed on the very morning she might have secured a huge settlement. But in court, clear doesn't cut it. They needed proof. By the late 1980s, the case had stalled. Witnesses were unwilling to testify, and those who might were deemed too risky without corroboration. The McClinton family pushed relentlessly, meeting with detectives, speaking to the media, refusing to let the case slip into cold file storage. They kept Lita's name in the headlines, a tactic as much about public pressure as about remembrance. The breakthrough didn't come for another decade. In the 1990s, Harwood resurfaced in law enforcement custody on unrelated charges. Facing his own legal problems, he was more open to making a deal. This time, he gave a fuller account. Sullivan had paid him $25,000 to arrange Lita's murder, money that Harwood then passed to Davis. The story fit the timeline and matched the few hard details police already had. With Harwood's statement, detectives re-engaged the case. They built around it phone records, financial activity, travel schedules. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the morning of January 16, 1987, and the months of planning before it. By the late 1990s, prosecutors felt confident they could finally secure an indictment. In 1998, a Fulton County grand jury issued a warrant for James Sullivan's arrest. But when police moved to serve it, the home in Palm Beach was empty. The man they had chased for more than a decade was gone. And so began the next chapter, one that would take the case far beyond Georgia, across continents, and into the kind of manhunt usually reserved for espionage or organized crime. By the time the Fulton County arrest warrant was signed in 1998, James Sullivan was already gone. He hadn't just stepped out of town. He had vanished with the precision of a man who'd been preparing for this moment for years. There were no quick goodbyes, no forwarding address, no trail of personal possessions left behind. The house in Palm Beach was stripped of signs of daily life. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in weeks. Credit cards, bank accounts, and phone lines under his name went silent. Sullivan hadn't just disappeared. He had erased himself. The FBI entered the case, placing him on its most wanted list. That brought a new level of intensity and new resources. Federal agents began piecing together fragments. Sightings in South America, rumors in Europe, hints from expats who had brushed shoulders with a well-dressed American living under an assumed name. The reports painted a picture of a man who could adapt quickly. In Brazil, he was seen at high-end resorts under an alias, keeping his distance from other Americans. In France, someone matching his description rented a villa for cash. In Southeast Asia, whispers circulated about a retired businessman from the States who paid generously for privacy. For years, the trail was like smoke, visible for a moment then gone. Sullivan's money was his greatest weapon. He could pay for the kind of anonymity that made tracking him maddeningly difficult. He avoided paper trails, rotated between countries without extradition treaties, and traveled under a collection of false documents. Back in Georgia, the McClinton family lived in a strange limbo. They had an indictment. The state had formally accused Sullivan of murder. But the man himself was beyond reach, living somewhere in the world while they waited for a break. Joan McClinton refused to let the case fade. She spoke to reporters, appeared on America's Most Wanted, and made sure her daughter's name stayed in the public conversation. Her reasoning was simple. Somewhere, someone had seen him, and one day that person might pick up the phone. That call came in 2002. A man living in Thailand contacted the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok after watching America's Most Wanted. He recognized the face on the screen, not just vaguely, but as his actual neighbor. The man in the episode, James Sullivan, was living under a false name in the coastal resort town of Chiam. He had a Thai fiancée, kept to himself, and seemed to have money but no visible work. The tip was passed to the FBI's legal attaché in Thailand. They confirmed enough details to act, then coordinated with Thai authorities to plan the arrest. The challenge was to move quietly. If Sullivan caught even a whisper of trouble, he could be gone in hours. In the pre-dawn hours of July 2, 2002, Thai police surrounded his condominium. When they knocked, Sullivan opened the door to find a wall of uniforms. There was no escape, no bargaining. The man who had spent nearly 15 years staying one step ahead of the law was in handcuffs before sunrise. For the McClinton family, the news was almost surreal. After so many false leads, so many rumors, it was hard to believe he was finally in custody. Joanne told reporters, "This is the call we've been waiting for. Now we can see this through." But even with Sullivan behind bars in Thailand, the journey to a Georgia courtroom was far from over. He had one more advantage left to play: the complexities of international law. James Sullivan's arrest in Thailand was a turning point, but it wasn't the end. For him, it was just the start of another fight. One that didn't involve running, but stalling. If he couldn't stay hidden, he could try to stay put. From his holding cell in Bangkok, Sullivan quickly hired lawyers familiar with both Thai and international law. Their strategy was simple: make the U.S. extradition process as slow and complicated as possible. And they had a major leverage point: Thailand's strict stance on the death penalty. Thai law prohibits extraditing someone to a country where they face execution, unless assurances are given that death won't be on the table. For prosecutors in Georgia, who had been building a death penalty case for years, that was a hard pill to swallow. But they knew they'd have to make the concession if they wanted Sullivan back. The negotiations were delicate. On one side, Fulton County's district attorney and the U.S. Department of Justice. On the other, Thai officials and Sullivan's defense team. The defense argued he wouldn't get a fair trial in Georgia, pointing to the massive publicity the case had generated. They questioned witness credibility, claimed the evidence was thin, and even raised human rights arguments about prison conditions in the U.S. Meanwhile, Sullivan settled into life as a high-profile detainee. Thai prisons were no luxury resorts, but compared to a Georgia state penitentiary, they offered certain unpredictabilities he could use to his advantage. He had access to his legal team, limited contact with the outside world, and time to hope that witnesses back in Georgia might die, forget, or recant. The McClinton family watched the proceedings from thousands of miles away, each delay twisting the knife. They had already waited 15 years for this man to face a jury. Now, the risk was that he might die in a foreign prison before ever seeing the inside of an Atlanta courtroom. In 2004, after nearly 2 years of legal back and forth, the Thai government announced its decision. Sullivan would be extradited to the United States, on the condition that the death penalty would not be sought. Georgia prosecutors agreed, trading the possibility of execution for the certainty of a trial. The FBI moved quickly. A team flew to Bangkok, took custody of Sullivan, and escorted him to the airport. The trip back to Atlanta was a reversal of the life he once lived. No first-class cabin, no tailored suit, just handcuffs, leg irons, and a plain jumpsuit. He sat between two federal agents, silent for most of the flight. When the plane landed in Georgia, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. After nearly 2 decades, James Vincent Sullivan was back in the state where his wife had been murdered. The man who had once toasted champagne on oceanfront balconies now stepped onto the tarmac as an inmate facing life behind bars. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited. The McClinton family arrived not with celebration, but with quiet resolve. Joe told reporters, "We've waited a long time for this moment. Now we want to see justice done." The next step would be the trial, a courtroom showdown between a prosecution determined to prove Sullivan orchestrated the killing, and a defense intent on painting him as the victim of unreliable witnesses and a vendetta. For both sides, the stakes could not have been higher. In early 2006, nearly 19 years after Lita Sullivan was murdered in her own doorway, the case against her husband went before a Fulton County jury. It was a trial that had been imagined, delayed, and reshaped for almost 2 decades. And now, there would be no more running, no more extradition hearings, no more hiding behind legal technicalities. The courthouse was a fortress of attention. News crews camped outside, sketch artists readied their pads, and every seat in the gallery was taken by journalists, law students, and members of the public who had followed the story since 1987. For the McClinton family, it was the moment they had fought for, though it came with the ache of knowing Lita herself would never see it. Jury selection was the first battle. Both sides combed through potential jurors for signs of bias. The prosecution wanted people who could see through charm and wealth, who understood that murder for hire rarely leaves fingerprints. The defense wanted skeptics, individuals wary of witness deals, sensitive to the idea that memories fade and stories change over time. After days of questioning, 12 jurors and 4 alternates were sworn in. The prosecution's opening statement was a careful weave of fact and emotion. They told the jury this was not a whodunit. They knew who pulled the trigger, who arranged the middleman, and who had the most to gain from Lita's death. But the man who benefited, James Sullivan, had insulated himself with layers of deniability. The challenge, they said, was to strip those layers away and reveal the deliberate orchestration beneath. They painted the picture. January 16, 1987, the morning of the divorce hearing. A deliverman with a florist's box. A single bullet to the head. A payment that traveled from Sullivan to Philip Harwood, from Harwood to Mark Davis, and from Davis into the act itself. This was not an accident, the prosecutor said. It was a business decision. The defense countered with a starkly different frame. They told the jury the state's case was built on unreliable witnesses, men who had cut deals to save themselves. They warned that after nearly 20 years, memories were malleable, details blurred, and motives twisted. Sullivan, they said, was not the villain prosecutors described, but a man whose wealth and strained marriage had made him an easy target for suspicion. Their refrain was simple. No direct evidence, no physical proof, just words from people with something to gain. The state's first witnesses began laying the groundwork. Crime scene investigators described the morning's events in clinical detail. Photographs showed the florist's box, the blood-stained doorway, the untouched rooms beyond. Neighbors testified about seeing the disguised gunman walking away. Each account was a brick in the wall the prosecution was building. When Philip Harwood took the stand, the energy in the courtroom shifted. He was the middle link in the chain, the man who said Sullivan had handed him $25,000 to arrange Lita's murder. He spoke quietly, but his testimony was devastating. Sullivan wanted Lita dead to avoid losing millions in the divorce, and he wanted it done on the morning of the hearing. Harwood admitted his own guilt. He had served time for his role, but insisted the truth was now his only reason for speaking. The defense went after him hard, hammering on inconsistencies between his statements over the years. suggesting he was lying to protect himself and had tailored his story to what prosecutors wanted to hear. Through it all, Sullivan sat still at the defense table, sometimes scribbling notes to his attorneys, sometimes staring at the witness with an expression that was impossible to read. To the jury, his stillness might have looked like composure or calculation. By the time the prosecution rested, they had presented a timeline, a motive, and a network of testimony that drew a direct line from Sullivan's Palm Beach life to the moment the trigger was pulled in Atlanta. But the defense was about to get its turn, and their strategy was clear: dismantle that line, piece by piece. When the prosecution rested, the defense rose with the quiet confidence of a team that believed the state's case had holes. Holes they could widen just enough to keep James Sullivan from a life sentence. Their strategy was twofold: dismantle the credibility of the state's key witnesses and remind the jury, again and again, that there was no physical evidence tying Sullivan to the murder. No fingerprints, no murder weapon recovered, no direct trail of money that could be traced from his hand to the triggerman's. The first witnesses for the defense were experts. A forensic psychologist spoke about the fallibility of memory, especially over long spans of time, suggesting that the recollections jurors had heard from witnesses like Philip Harwood were inevitably shaped by the passage of nearly 20 years and repeated interviews. A former FBI agent testified about the dangers of tunnel vision in homicide cases, how investigators can focus too quickly on one suspect, filtering all new evidence through that lens. The implication was clear. From the very morning of January 16, 1987, James Sullivan had been the man in the police's eyes, and everything after that was built to fit the theory. Then came character witnesses. Friends and business associates described Sullivan as a generous man, an intelligent negotiator, and someone who was devastated by Lita's death. They painted a portrait of a complicated but caring husband, not a cold-blooded killer. The defense also highlighted what they saw as inconsistencies in Harwood's testimony. They reminded the jury that Harwood had been facing serious time in prison before making a deal with prosecutors, and that deal depended on him delivering a story that implicated Sullivan. Cross-examination forced Harwood to admit he'd lied in earlier statements, though he insisted the version he told now was the truth. The defense turned its attention to Mark Davis, the alleged triggerman. Davis wasn't in the courtroom. He had died years earlier, but his name and alleged role were key to the state's case. Without him to testify, the defense argued, jurors were left with hearsay and second-hand accounts, none of which could be directly tested under cross-examination. Sullivan himself did not take the stand. His lawyers made the calculated decision to keep him silent, believing that cross-examination could open doors the prosecution was eager to walk through. Instead, they ended their case with a simple message: suspicion is not proof, and the state's burden is to eliminate reasonable doubt, something they said the evidence had not come close to doing. When both sides rested, the jury had spent weeks listening to stories that often contradicted each other. They had seen photographs from a crime scene that felt like a snapshot from another lifetime. They had heard from people who admitted to lying before, but swore they were telling the truth now. And they had watched Sullivan, calm, controlled, and silent, throughout it all. In closing arguments, the prosecution told jurors the evidence formed a clear, consistent pattern. A man facing a massive financial loss, a murder timed to stop it, and a chain of events that could not have happened without his order. The defense countered that the pattern was an illusion, a story built on unreliable narrators, where the gaps had been filled with assumption and bias. The jury was dismissed to deliberate, taking with them almost 2 decades of history, 2 sharply opposed narratives, and the weight of knowing their decision would define the rest of James Sullivan's life. The door to the jury room closed with a heavy, deliberate sound. For the first time in nearly a month, the lawyers, reporters, and spectators could do nothing but wait. The case that had traveled through decades, crossed continents, and consumed untold investigative hours now rested entirely in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens. Inside, the jurors began by taking a quick, informal vote, not to decide guilt but to see where they stood. A majority leaned toward conviction, but there were a few holdouts. Those jurors weren't ready to declare Sullivan guilty on the basis of testimony from men who had admitted to lying in the past. They wanted to comb through every piece of evidence again. They started with the timeline, The morning of January 16, 1987. The florist's box. The single gunshot. The divorce hearing scheduled for later that day. To the prosecution, it had been a seamless sequence leading straight back to Sullivan's motive. To the defense, it was a coincidence tied together by speculation. Next came the testimony of Philip Harwood. For hours, jurors reread transcripts, weighing whether his account, that Sullivan paid him $25,000 to arrange the hit, was believable. Some pointed out that his story had been consistent for years after his plea deal. Others noted that his deal itself gave him every reason to say what prosecutors wanted to hear. They discussed the absence of physical evidence. No fingerprints from Sullivan. No bank statements showing a direct payment to the shooter. No murder weapon recovered. One juror argued that in murder-for-hire cases that absence was the point. The person paying for the crime never touched the weapon. Another countered that without something tangible, they were being asked to convict a man on faith in other people's words. As the hours passed, the conversation shifted. They began to see the pattern not as isolated points, but as a web, motive, timing, opportunity, and the chain of people who claimed to have been involved. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps. But the question wasn't whether the case was perfect. It was whether the evidence left any reasonable doubt. By the second day, the holdouts were softening. One juror who had been hesitant said they couldn't ignore the precision of the crime, the way it aligned exactly with Sullivan's looming divorce settlement. Another admitted that while they distrusted Harwood, too many other details, the disguise, the payment, the timing, matched his account for it to be pure invention. On the afternoon of the third day, the foreperson called for another vote. This time it was unanimous. They sent word to the bailiff. They had a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. The McClinton family sat in the front row, hands clasped. Sullivan entered in a dark suit, face unreadable. The jury filed in, their expressions careful, almost guarded. The clerk read the charge. We, the jury, find the defendant, James Vincent Sullivan, guilty of malice murder. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the words were spoken in open court. Guilty. Joan McClinton closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she had been holding for years. Sullivan stood motionless, absorbing the reality that his long run was over. The judge thanked the jurors for their service, then moved to sentencing. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. As deputies led Sullivan away, he turned once toward the gallery. Not to his lawyers, not to the reporters, but toward no one in particular, as if searching the room for a trace of the life he'd left behind. For the McClintons, it wasn't joy they felt, but a deep, quiet relief. The fight was over. The justice they had chased for 19 years had finally caught up. When the cell door clanged shut behind James Sullivan, it was the sound of finality, at least for the moment. His world shrank to the size of a Georgia prison cell, a far cry from the oceanfront balconies and tailored suits that had once defined his life. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, he no longer controlled the clock. The days moved according to the rhythm of count times, meal calls, and lockdowns. The quiet that once served him as a tool, the stillness he used in court to project calm, now became something else entirely. In prison, silence is not power. It's just the absence of choice. The appeals came quickly. Sullivan's lawyers argued that the trial judge had erred in allowing certain witness testimony, that the publicity over the years had poisoned the jury pool, and that key witnesses were unreliable. The Georgia Supreme Court reviewed the case, but the conviction stood. The justices noted that while the state's case rested heavily on witness accounts, those accounts were corroborated by circumstantial evidence that, taken together, was compelling. With each failed appeal, Sullivan's chances of leaving prison alive narrowed. He was in his 60s when he was sentenced. A life term without parole was, in practical terms, a death sentence. For the McClinton family, the verdict didn't erase the loss, but it did close the loop on a fight that had consumed nearly 20 years of their lives. Joanne and Emery turned their focus toward preserving Lita's memory in ways that went beyond the courtroom. They established scholarships in her name, spoke at community events about domestic violence and the warning signs of controlling relationships, and worked with advocacy groups to push for stronger protections for victims. They wanted Lita's story to be more than a cautionary tale. They wanted it to be a catalyst, In Atlanta's legal circles, the Sullivan case became a reference point, a reminder of the persistence needed in long-term investigations and the role of patience in building a circumstantial case. For the FBI, it was a textbook example of why public engagement matters. Without the tip from Thailand, Sullivan might still have been a free man. Inside prison walls, Sullivan kept to himself. Inmates described him as polite but distant, a man who carried himself as though he were simply waiting out an inconvenience rather than serving a life sentence. He avoided trouble, kept his head down, and lived in a bubble of books, television, and legal correspondence. The world outside moved on. News cycles changed, true crime shows picked up newer cases, and Sullivan's story began to fade from headlines. But for those who had lived it, the McClintons, the detectives, the prosecutors, the case remained vivid. They knew how close it had come to being an unsolved murder, how many points along the way could have gone differently. By the late 2010s, Sullivan was just another name on the Georgia Department of Corrections roster, inmate number, birth date, conviction record. But for the people who had waited 19 years to see him there, that line of text was the proof they had fought for. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest memories, but some events resist fading. The murder of Lita McClinton Sullivan is one of them, not because of the violence itself, but because of the relentless pursuit of justice that followed. For 19 years, her case was a story without an ending. It lived in old news footage, in court filings, in the faces of detectives who refused to close the file. And when that ending finally came, when James Sullivan heard the word guilty, it was not a moment of triumph, but one of solemn balance. Justice had arrived, but so had the full weight of what had been lost. Lita's legacy endures most clearly through her family. Joanne and Emery McClinton carried her story into schools, community centers, and legislative hearings. They spoke about the warning signs in controlling relationships, about the ways wealth and privilege can mask abuse, and about the importance of persistence when the justice system moves slowly. They wanted others to see beyond the headlines, to remember Lita not only as a victim, but as the vibrant, ambitious woman she was, a daughter, sister, and friend with a full life ahead of her. For law enforcement, the Sullivan case is a lesson in endurance. It's a reminder that murder-for-hire cases rarely yield quick answers, that the middlemen are often as elusive as the masterminds, and that the truth can hinge on one person's decision to come forward. It's also a study in the power of public engagement. Without the tip from Thailand, Sullivan might never have faced a jury. For the legal system, it's a cautionary tale about time. As the years pass, witnesses die, memories fade, and evidence can be lost. But the Sullivan case shows that with careful preservation and strategic pressure, even decades-old crimes can be brought to trial and won. And for the public, it's a story about perception. From the outside, James Sullivan lived a life many might envy: wealth, travel, influence. But beneath that surface was a marriage marked by control, infidelity, and, ultimately, lethal intent. The case forces a reckoning with the truth that appearances can be dangerously misleading. In the end, the image that lingers isn't of courtrooms or prison cells, but of a young woman on the threshold of a new chapter. On the morning she was killed, Lita was preparing to step into her independence, to reclaim her life on her own terms. That was taken from her in an instant, but the fight to honor her, to speak her name, to demand accountability, stretched across continents and decades. Her story is now part of the larger fabric of true crime history, yes, but for those who loved her, it is something far more personal. It is a reminder that justice is rarely swift, never easy, and always incomplete. But it matters. It matters enough to wait 19 years. It matters enough to fight for until the very end. And maybe that's the real ending. Not the moment the verdict was read, but the quiet knowledge that, even in the long shadow of loss, Lita's voice was not silenced.